Hello and welcome to a special one-hour edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. My name is Andrew McKeever. I'm the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Wednesday, October 3rd, and we're pleased to be joined here in the studio by the three candidates who are running for the two seats in the Bennington-4 district. With us today are Brian Keefe, Cynthia Browning, and Kathleen James. As many of you know, that district includes the towns of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland, and it's a two-member district. The incumbents are Brian Keefe, who won election to the seat in 2016, and Cynthia Browning, who first served in the legislature in 2007, has represented the town of Arlington, Sunderland, and Sandgate, and West Rupert until the district was reconfigured following the 2010 census and reapportionment into a two-member district, and so she's been serving since 2007. Kathleen James is their challenger. She joined the race, making her first try for public office this year. And so we want to hear from all three of them today about their views on some of the issues that are of importance to you folks who are watching us today. Many of you will recall that about a week or so ago, we had a forum at Burton Academy where we discussed a number of the issues. At the time, the three candidates were joined by Linda Joy Sullivan, who is running for re-election to the that's the Bennington-Rutland 1 district, which includes Dorset, Danby, and three other towns. So it's great to have the three of you here to focus on the Bennington-4 district, and of course, it's also a competitive race because we have three candidates for two seats. I should point out that Brian Keefe is running as a Republican, Cynthia Browning as a Democrat, and Kathleen James also as a Democrat. So, what's been the feedback you've been hearing? What are some of the issues that the voters you've spoken to so far have sort of said are the most important or critical to them? I mean, there's the small set of hardy perennials like taxes and education spending and things like that. But are those still the dominant questions, or are there other issues that you've been hearing that said, wow, that's something I hadn't really thought about, or something new in the picture?
I can start on that one. I've been knocking on an awful lot of doors, and it's actually my favorite part of campaigning. I really like going up to voters' homes and meeting them and introducing myself and saying hello. And while the hardy perennials, as you said, do tend to come up, again and again, what I've primarily found is this notion that I was talking about in my opening statement about government as collaborative, government as collegial, about people up in Montpelier and here in our communities still being able to really talk across the aisle. People are genuinely, it's funny, volunteers they're so afraid to go knock doors for you. They think it's going to be this fight or this confrontation. And I have found these conversations to be really positive. People are excited to meet you. They want to hear what you're interested in. They want to tell you what matters to them. And I think by and large, it's a really affirming experience that tells me that here in Vermont, bipartisan and tripartisan cooperation is still really the norm, and it's where everybody's coming from. So I've found it to be a great experience.
I've certainly heard about education, finance, and property taxes. I've heard about Act 46, which is important for some of the areas in our district. I've heard about health insurance costs and also the gun regulations. I've had discussions about that. And I think that just to echo one of the things that Kathleen said, the sense that many working families and small businesses have that the deck is stacked against them. And that's a really, really important aspect of our economy and whether it's benefiting everybody. And the key thing that I have to offer is that my analysis of the tax code and the budget has shown some of the places where there are like hidden subsidies for large corporations and for high-income people that are part of how that stacking of the deck occurs. And those are some of the things I want to go back and correct in an equitable way, equitable for everybody. But I think the deck is stacked, and I think you have to not just protest against that, but figure out how to fix it. But I also think that I do think that the gun legislation came up, and that was new for this year, because although we did actually have gun legislation a couple of years ago, this is the biggest thing that we did. Mm-hmm. And I heard people on on both sides. I would say that even some people who didn't think we should pass it could accept most of it, but some people couldn't accept any of it, and some people were like, why didn't you do more? So it was just like all over the place.
And Brian, I know it's your turn, but I just quickly want to say that my best door knocking experience was with a guy who wanted to talk to me about the gun bill who was not wearing pants. So
Okay.
So
Continue.
you never know.
Wow.
Never know what you're going to get.
Well, I haven't experienced that one yet. So.
May you never.
So taxes, property taxes, affordability are, I think, on the minds of a lot of people. I think a lot of people are a little upset that we raised the tax on rental property and business property and second homes at the end of the session last year. I don't think we needed to do that. There were other ways to go about it. And when you talk about affordability and you turn around and raise taxes on rental property, it's kind of contradictory. I also hear a lot about the social safety net programs, and Vermont is very generous in that regard, and I'm on the Human Services Committee, so we heard a lot about it. When we sat here 2 years ago, we talked about the benefit cliff, and I remember saying, one of the other participants 2 years ago said that we still haven't solved that, and I remember saying that it was a disgrace that we have this benefit cliff where people, especially at the child care level, they lose more if they get a raise or are offered a promotion. They often have to turn it down because they'll lose more. They're just making an economic decision to keep more money in their pockets because they're at that marginal affordability thing already. So I had my bill, the benefit cliff bill, that allowed parents that were getting a child care subsidy to keep that subsidy if they put some of their raise into a long-term savings account, and that allows them to stay on their career progression. And as a result of that, the speaker appointed me to be on the minimum wage study committee. She had 150 people to choose from, and I was one of the 3 that was appointed to be on that committee because minimum wage and benefit cliffs go hand in hand. So people like to see those kind of solutions, I think. And another bill I had to do with a reach-up bill, when this is a temporary assistance for people who are out of work and who have children. And we had 2 sets of rules. The federal rules didn't match the state rules, and there was all this time and effort being wasted on that. And my bill just simply said we're going to have 1 set of rules. And I introduced the bill and worked it through committee, presented it on the House floor, went to the Senate committees and explained it there. And so those are the types of solutions people like to see. But meanwhile, the other thing that's out there is people sometimes feel our social benefit programs are a little generous. They see a lot of people out there that they wonder, with so many jobs available, why aren't this person working or that person working? And so enforcement of some of these programs and oversight of the programs, I think, is a continuing thing we have to look at, because if people, and I'm not saying it's widespread or rampant, but every instance of someone cheating the system is an instance of basically taking that money away from someone who otherwise needs it. And so on the Human Services Committee, yeah, we're trying to put structure in there so that the programs run most efficiently, most effective for those people that need them. But in answer to your question, what else am I hearing? I'm hearing a little frustration that maybe we need to have some better oversight of some of these programs.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about one of those hardy perennials I mentioned earlier, education spending. We sort of discussed this a little bit there back at the forum at Burn a week or so ago. But I wanted to kind of explore a little bit more what your thinking on Act 46 was. As you all know, the State Board of Education will be coming up with its final report by the end of November that will deal with the 40 or so districts that are still unmerged or unreconfigured. And 2 of them are in your district, yes. Arlington and Sandgate. So I guess I was just wondering, how do you think Act 46 so far has played out? And do you feel like it's been productive, constructive legislation? And what are your thoughts about where Arlington and Sandgate should, in a perfect world, end up in this report that the State Board will be making public by the end of November?
I'll give that a shot, at least to start out with. First of all, I think that all the voluntary mergers that have taken place, including in our district, were really good. I think there are going to be a lot of benefits from sharing resources and benefits for students, which is, remember, the most important things, that they get a better education, and also eventually I think cost mitigation, not necessarily costs going down, but not growing as fast. So if you can have better quality and you have cost control, that's really good. However, and I've always supported voluntary mergers. However, the fact that Act 46 gives the State Board of Education, which is an unelected body, the ability to force mergers, which means they can actually dissolve, eliminate a democratically elected school board and tell the town, this is your new district. And that, to me, is really undemocratic. It's against the idea that decision-making power should be at the lowest level. When towns voluntarily do it, although to some extent it was like, yeah, we'll give you an incentive, but if you don't do it, we may force you. So voluntary maybe in quotes. But when they voluntarily do it, that's fine. But when you're going to be dissolving school districts, I don't think that's right. I think that's as if the federal government said to Vermont, you know, you're really small. You don't deserve 2 senators. It'd be much more cost effective if we put you together with New Hampshire. That's wrong. That's just wrong, even if it's not happening in our area. And it still could happen. So I never liked the forced mergers. I also didn't like the fact that the cost of the merger incentives are paid for within the Ed Fund, so that Manchester and Dorset and Sunderland and all the other schools are not actually getting the property tax reduction that they think they're getting. So in other words, if they're supposed to be getting a 2 cent this year, but the cost of all the incentives is $14 million, if you put all of that on the homestead rate, that's 3 cents. So in other words, they think they're getting a 2 cent reduction, but actually the overall property tax rate is 3 cents higher than it would otherwise be. So they're only getting a 1 cent reduction. So at the time that Act 46 passed, I pointed this out at the floor of the House, and the supporters of it didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to admit it, didn't know how much money it would be. And they pushed it through anyway. So the forced mergers, dissolving school boards, and the question of not getting the incentive you promised, those are wrong. And those are 2 of the reasons I voted against Act 46. That being said, I think if the mergers can work, that's really good. I think that we should be getting true property tax reductions instead of this netting out. And that was the, to my mind, deceptiveness of the state. In terms of Sandgate and Arlington, everybody always knew this district was a problem area because they didn't have nearby partners that had the same configuration. Just to remind people, you have to have the same number of grades that you're offering. So Sandgate's all choice. There's nobody right around that's all choice. Arlington is pre-K through 12. There's nobody right around that's pre-K through 12. They have no dance partners. They always knew this, and they put in place some kind of alternative structure, but it wasn't flexible enough, and everybody knew it, and we all said it has to be more flexible, and they were like, no, it has to be like this. So as far as I can tell, the only future that I see, because right now you've got this tiny supervisory union with just 2 towns, and there are reasons for that historically, but I understand how people would say that's not viable. The only place I can see is to go into BRSU as another unit there, but I know that BRSU is digesting the Taconic and Green merged district, and I'm not sure they really need to take something else on. So it might be that might be what happens in the future. But that's going to be up to the school board, an unelected body that's going to make that decision. What I think is really important is that neither of those districts be forced to merge or be forced to dissolve, which I think that board still has the power to do. And boy, do I think that would be wrong. Sometimes schools have to close, sometimes things have to be changed like that, but communities should be given the respect to be allowed to make that decision themselves. And that's one of the things that was wrong about Act 46 and why I voted against it.
Well, let me step back and just, Act 46 is a merger of governance. And, you know, eventually the Taconic and Green, I think we've come to a decent solution there, partly because, and I agree with most of what Cynthia says. The Taconic and Green, you had Dorset and Manchester and Danby and Sunderland. They had to change a little bit, but you had an opportunity to merge those governance structures because they had lined up with a K through 8 and then a high school situation. But it took a while to get there. And meanwhile, up in Chittenden County, you had towns like Williston, Heinsberg, Charlotte, and Shelburne, I believe, 4 of the wealthiest towns in the state. They already all matched up. They already were doing a lot of this stuff. And so when Act 46 passed, and then you have the kind of a third group of the outliers right now that are having a hard time figuring out how they are going to comply with the letter of the law. So you had the Chittenden County towns. They jumped into this merger thing real quick, and immediately they began to get their incentives. I think it started out at 10 cents off their property tax, and then 8, 6. So boom, they're getting this money from us. And this, I see this as a pattern that happens quite often. The laws are passed that work for Chittenden County and the folks up north, and down here we're just kind of an afterthought, frankly. So Chittenden County, they lined up all these things. They started getting their incentives. We started paying them for doing this. Taconic and Green came in a little bit later, so we're getting at the tail end of some of those incentives. But as Cynthia pointed out, by now the costs and incentives are relatively the same, so it kind of washes. And then you have Sandgate and Arlington that don't get any of this.
And they're just paying.
And they're just paying, and they don't have an easy place to go. So just thematically, I agree with Cynthia. The governance mergers are generally speaking good. I don't like the forced mergers that many towns are facing right now. I don't think that's going to happen down here in Sandgate and Arlington, but we'll wait and see. And meanwhile, it's just another example of the power of the politics up north and being able to do things, impose conditions on us that don't always work. Taconic and Green, I think, is a good case study, and I think that's all going to work out. The other 2 towns are still in this state of uncertainty.
I can keep my answer brief because I think we're all in general philosophical agreement. I think there are cases in which Act 46 is working and will start to work, increasingly as intended to get those larger districts some savings, hopefully over time, and as you said, better opportunities for kids and a stronger kind of systemic approach. Mm-hmm. I think that's great. I've said several times that I think forced mergers are not great. I really hope Arlington and Sandgate are able to come up with some sort of different long-term solution. In general, I guess I am just am always going to want to try to err on the side of local control when it comes to our school boards. I do like to trust our local school boards to make the decisions and set the budgets that they feel are best for their schools. One of the proposals that was floated this year that I probably would not have supported was a mandated student-teacher ratio from Montpelier. I understand the impetus, but I feel like our local schools know best what they need in terms of staffing.
What do you all think is the tipping point, if there is one, around closing small schools? This question came up at the State Board of Education meeting held a couple of weeks ago over in Chester. One of the folks from the town of Wyndham, I think it was, their small elementary school is facing extinction. It's, I guess, really tiny, a micro school.
16.
Right. And that was a subject that had a couple of their board members highly concerned. Is there a point, you think, where it comes where a school is just so small or so inefficient or so costly? Because I think Act 46 at some point was intended to eventually sort of ease pressure on property taxes by forcing some consolidations and lowering costs wherever possible without sacrificing education quality. But is there a point in your minds that say, okay, if a school gets down to X number of kids, then we need to look at doing something else? Or is it just a case where, hey, schools are so important to the identities of communities and it's such a big part of the local culture that they're just, things really have to get really bad before we can
But don't you think it has to be a combination of things? Because remember, the nature of the education that the students are getting is the key thing. So a small school has to be able to send those students to the next stage prepared, ready to go on. As long as they're doing that, I think they have a claim to viability even as they get small, but they get expensive. Although remember that in some of the smallest rural areas, the salaries for teachers are not the way they are in Chittenden County and other kinds of places. So these do not necessarily have high overall costs, even if they have high per pupil costs. So the property taxpayers have to be willing to pay that. If the quality of the education is good, I think it should be up to the community, because when they no longer want to pay that cost, that's their decision. It's true that because of the way we share all the costs, if somebody has high costs, it's shared. But remember, these are tiny, tiny, really small parts of the overall budget. They're not making, what they do is not making our property taxes go up. And sometimes you close a school and they tuition all the students and their costs actually rise because the tuition rates at the schools that they're sending it to are higher than their per pupil cost was. So you have to, it's really case by case. But to me, the quality of the education is really key. My understanding in places that actually have closed their schools, usually what it was is that parents started sending their kids in other places and paying the tuition themselves because they were not confident of the quality of education. And when you start to have that kind of drain, then it's not viable, and that's when when they realized that they could not offer the math classes that the kids needed at the next level. That's particularly small high schools, and you were talking about a small elementary school. But either way, if you can't give the students what they need, then I think the community begins to recognize it. Sometimes it takes the community longer than it takes an outsider, but that's part of democracy, and that's why I think the community has to make that decision. Also, when we look at small schools, it's important not just to look at the number of students, but also where is the next closest school and what is the geography. Because in fact, Wyndham, which is extremely small, is like up on top of a mountain, and even though it's 15 miles to the nearest school, it's 15 miles like this, and given Vermont weather, you want to send 5-year-olds on that. So you have to look at these different things. But the first thing, just as with Act 46, has to be the quality of the education the students are getting, what the community can support. Without quality of education, just saying it's a community center, I don't think that does it. But if you're maintaining the quality of education, you're willing to pay for it, and it's an important part of your community, which I think it is, then the communities have to make that decision. We need to respect that.
I spoke already about how important I think local control is, so I really don't have anything to add.
Well, Andrew, it's a good question. At what point do you force some school to close in a small community? And I think Cynthia captured most of the reasons why I think we all agree that the state should not force these closures. In many cases, there's no savings to be had by changing where a student goes to school.
Because you're tuitioning, you're going to pay tuition.
And the numbers are, by definition, by the nature of your question, the numbers are so small to begin with. And a lot of these schools are remote. So, it's got to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but I don't think any of us supports the forced mergers for the reasons you cite. But again, it's a creature of this notion that Montpelier knows best on how to do this, and they can pass this one big Act 46 law, and it's just going to magically work as it finds its way around the state. Not that easy at all. One of the surprises in my first year up there, or the first term, was how few people understand how education funding works. It's unbelievable. You get onto the floor of the House and Act 46 is one thing, but we have bigger problems than that. The whole financing system is something that people are very concerned about because they keep seeing cost pressures and tax pressures. And somebody in one town can vote a level budget and their taxes go up, and somebody over here can raise their budget by 5% and their taxes go down. And try to find any legislator that can explain that. But Cynthia, you would agree, there's only a handful of people, legislators, that have voted for this, that have been there for years, in some cases decades, and they cannot explain it.
And that's just wrong. It's wrong.
So there's bigger problems than spending all this energy on these schools like up in Winhall. Let them figure it out. There's no real measurable savings to be had for the whole system. And meanwhile, for the state to come in and say, I know you like your school because you can drop your child off and then go to work next door, but we're going to change that and you're going to have to bus them 20 miles. And most of these are elementary school kids, and many of the elementary are the lower elementary grades. So I don't think we should force those mergers.
All right, let me switch over to another subject that has gotten a lot of attention the last couple of years, and that's a question around opioids and the opioid problem. If I had asked this question a week or so ago when we were meeting at Burn Burton, I probably would have asked it, and I think we actually did get into a conversation about, well, what more should we do in Bennington County than we're presently doing? Since then, I happen to notice an article about how Bennington County has become one of the 3 counties in the state to participate in a pilot program for recovering addicts, which sounds like it aims to provide more wraparound services for people who are entering recovery instead of just sort of, if you're fortunate enough to get into a treatment center and then come out after a month or 2 or whatever the time period is. It sounded to me like you could then kind of lift on your own. You kind of, there was some support that might be, some phone numbers that might be given to you, but basically you kind of, you're on your own. This program seems to be an attempt to kind of help transition those folks who are coming out of treatment into some kind of situation where they're not on their own. But I guess I just wondered, Bennington County seems to be one of those parts of the state where we seem to have a lot of issues going on with opioids. I guess I just feel like I'd like to kind of flesh out some of the discussion we had there a week ago. What more could be done? For instance, should there be, for instance, a methadone center in Bennington? Or would you favor something like a safe injection site, which has been mentioned for Burlington? Very controversial and not, I guess, widely popular around the state, but are there some alternatives like that you think ought to maybe be at least discussed or perhaps tried for our part of the state to see if that might help out folks who are trying to kind of break out of the box of addiction? I can
take that one first. That's a great question. I read about the same program. I was really excited, I'm sure you guys read about it too, to see that the Bennington Hospital had received a federal grant and was partnering with Turning Point to provide recovery coaches who are, when someone comes into the hospital with a drug-related, like an overdose or something, a recovery coach is called. If these people are trained, they're in recovery themselves, they come to the hospital or connect with these people and provide sort of the peer support you need to start moving into recovery, connecting with that recovery community. So I think that's a great example of a program that we should try to replicate around the state. It looked like some other counties were maybe going to pursue that. In terms of what more could be done, I know that the nut of the question is always how to responsibly pay for these programs. And that's going to inform every decision that gets made. But I would love to see us investing to the greatest extent we can in harm reduction. So in other words, focusing first our efforts on those programs that will save lives. I have been trying to read and learn a little bit about clean needle exchanges. That would be a place where somebody could go and get a clean needle. Unlimited use of Narcan. Narcan, as we know, saves lives. And I know up in Chittenden County, the state's attorney up there has basically decided to stop prosecuting people for having Suboxone. So that's the prescription drug that is used in medically assisted treatment, and she's basically not going to prosecute that as a crime. I'd love to see us put more resources into diversion programs, drug court. So I think those are just some of many ideas that we could and should. I think it is a priority for the state and needs to continue to be. It's an issue I'd be really passionate about working on.
I think that we need to work on both ends. We need to work on preventing new addictions, and we need to work on treating those already addicted. And Kathleen was just talking about some of the ways to support people who need help with their addiction, but I think we need to continue to work with patients, doctors, pharmacists about being sure that when people, have minor surgery and they get, a pain control, that they're not given 40 pills or 50 pills. They're given 10 pills and then they can come back for more, so that we're not setting up possibility of abuse either through somebody continuing to use it or through somebody having these pills and then someone steals it from them. I'm still hearing about people being given a lot of pills. We need to remember this all started with the pharmaceutical company marketing a pain management drug that they said was not addictive, and they were wrong. That's where it all started, and most of the people on heroin and fentanyl, my understanding is they usually start with prescriptions and then get into trouble. So we need to be preventing the development of future addictions. Anybody who needs treatment needs to be able to get treatment, and we are not at that point. And I wish there was some way we could tax the pharmaceutical manufacturers in order to fund that treatment. But so far, we haven't figured out a way to do that that doesn't make insurance costs and things go up. So that's to be continued. But I think it's really important that for people to get public tax dollars, they're at a point where they're saying, yes, I need treatment. Whether it's abstinence or drug-assisted treatment or therapy, whatever it is, I'm willing to try that. And people often have to try several times before it works. This stuff is really difficult to get off of. And we need to understand that and be willing to support people. But I must differ with Kathleen in terms of a safe injection site. There are so many issues with that in terms of liability if someone injects themselves and then leaves and has a car
Actually, I was
accident.
talking about a clean needle exchange.
Clean needle
That's
exchange is
different.
fine, yes, but last week you talked about the safe injection sites from Brenda Siegel's proposal, and I believe it did have safe injection sites. And I really, whether or not
Her
you
plan
support,
does include that,
excuse me, whether or not you support it now, you did refer to it last week, and I think that to have public tax dollars going to facilitate use or support use, I can't do that. The liability, the illegality, the questions of what your facility, to me, overwhelm the question of trying to be sure someone doesn't overdose. Because the best way for someone not to overdose is to come in and get treatment. And I would like for any ER doctor to be able to, if someone's overdosing in their Narcan, the way you were describing, that immediately they have access to treatment. If they come into the hospital in withdrawal, immediately they go to treatment. That's the kind of thing we have to have. So we have to be treating everybody who's already addicted, who comes into any contact with the state. That's why we're trying to do better in corrections, treating people with drug problems in corrections. So we need to do all of those things, but none of them are going to be magic bullets. And I think that we need to do as much as we can at the prevention end too, because that's how the thing is going to heal. And sometimes it takes a generational process. I'm old enough to remember cocaine and crack cocaine, and it almost took young people growing up and seeing their parents, their older brothers and sisters overdosing and dying, and they said, I'm never going to do that. And they didn't. So sometimes it takes time, and that's a terrible thing to have to say. But we have to face reality. If we don't face reality, we're not going to make any progress. But I think prevention and treatment, both ends.
The opioid crisis is still a growing problem, and our capacity is growing to meet it, but we're not there yet. So we need to work on education, enforcement, treatment, and first responders, our fire, rescue, and medical personnel, police. They need more assistance on all this. Just real quickly, on the safe injection sites, I'm against that. And just if people aren't aware, this is a place where if you are an addict, you can go to some place that's safe and you can shoot up under some kind of supervision. So in case something does go wrong, there's someone there. It has been proposed in Burlington. I'm against it. In fairness, maybe we give Kathleen a chance to clarify what her position is.
Well, the Brenda Siegel plan included that, and she supported the Brenda Siegel plan last week.
In fairness.
Okay.
Yep, however, I did say in general that I think Brenda has some great ideas and that I would be interested in learning more about her plan and exploring her plan. That doesn't mean that I support every bullet point in her plan. So I think a clean needle exchange is very important. A safe injection site, I know that Sarah has had proposed one or talked about one up in Burlington. Safe injection sites, they do save lives. There's no doubt about that. If somebody is, it's a place where somebody can go who might otherwise be dying. So it's worth considering. I don't know how I'd feel about that specific part of her proposal, so I'm glad we clarified that.
Okay, let's move on to another issue that was kind of I guess a leftover piece of business from the legislative session this past year. I'm talking about family leave and minimum wage. Proposals came up, they were voted through, the governor vetoed them, and I assume that it's probably possible that we may see those issues revisited in the coming term to start in 2019. And I guess I just, again, just go around the table. Do you think we should have a minimum wage bill passed that is more or less similar to the one that Governor Scott vetoed this past spring? Ditto on the family leave bill. What are your thoughts on those two issues?
Well, I think on the minimum wage bill, it's important that people realize that we've actually increased the minimum wage in Vermont 3 times, from $8.73 to $10.50 since 2014. So we have been increasing the minimum wage, and it will continue to go up with inflation going forward. So it's going to continue to go up. It's certainly not at 15 or whatever people might want, but we have increased it, and it's really important to give businesses a chance to adjust to those changes, to my mind, before we commit to further changes. As time passes and we understand the implications of what we've already done, I'm more open to doing more. I just can't put in place more increases before we understand what we did. That's part of doing reality-based policy. It's also really important to note that the minimum wage bill that was considered last session had no size limit on the businesses. I mean, we just had news today about Amazon committing to $15 an hour. There was no limit that only companies above 100 have to do this, and below that they don't. Requiring Amazon or Walmart or giant corporations to have them, I'm right there. But most of the jobs in Vermont are with small businesses. And so if you only limit it to large corporations, you won't get at everybody. But the idea that a small business in the Northeast Kingdom, a diner in the Northeast Kingdom or a general store in the Northeast Kingdom can pay the kind of wage that Amazon can pay, that's just not true. And it won't work. There was no exemption, there was no variation in the minimum wage bill for metropolitan areas like Burlington and the Northeast Kingdom or Bennington County. So I am open to doing what we can for the working poor, but the bill that was suggested didn't deal with the benefits cliff, so some people would get a raise and then lose benefits and be no better off. It didn't deal with regional variations. It didn't deal with any kind of size on the company. So we need to be sure that working people really get help and not do things that might end up hurting them if they lose benefits or they lose hours. Because oftentimes when the wages go up, the company has to cut back on the hours because they can't afford it, or they start to substitute into technology. So it's really important that we understand what we're doing. And the question of the earned income tax credit or dealing with the benefits cliff in a better way and waiting until we're sure what the new wage should be and when we should get there, that's what we need to do. Not just go with $15 slogans, all this kind of stuff. Because the places that can afford it, like Seattle or San Francisco, the market's already doing it there. If people in Burlington want to pay $15 an hour, they can do that. But the idea that every small business in Vermont has to do that now, or even 3 years from now, when they've already had to absorb several dollars worth of increase, I think we need to be really careful.
Sure. Minimum wage is one of the issues, you know, as I have thought about running and thought about serving, minimum wage is one of the issues that I've struggled with the most. As Cynthia just said, it can have unintended consequences. It's complicated when you start turning the Rubik's Cube of the economy. You know, the colors don't always line up as you might expect. And so I started out today by saying that I'm motivated to run by this feeling that working families can't catch up. You know, that you can work full-time and you can't afford food, that you can work full-time and you can't afford housing. And so the question is, you know, how do you fix that? And here in Vermont, a statistic that I was really interested to come across was what they called the housing wage. Obviously, you guys have heard of that. And it says that you need to be earning about $22 an hour to afford to rent a 2-bedroom home. And our wages lag, you know, significantly below that, so there's that gap. So I think some of the things that you guys have been working on, the earned income tax credit, the benefits cliff, are really helpful. If I were to support a minimum wage, and you know, I didn't have the benefit of being able to read the entire bill and hear testimony and stuff. If I were to support it, It would only be if it were set to raise gradually over 6 years. It would be rising faster, I understand, than inflation, so it would be rising faster than it's set to raise right now. And how I would make that decision would probably be to start out by talking to small business owners as much as I could here in the North Shire. Maybe hold a series of town meetings or a series of forums so I could really hear firsthand how businesses right here in our community are, how they would handle that. I've talked to a few. I'd like to talk to many, many more. Some would maybe have an incremental or very minimal price increase. We would want to be careful that that didn't then impact people living on a fixed income. Some maybe would lay off workers. You don't want that. But I've also talked to small business owners here in the North Shire, just anecdotally stopping by their businesses as I'm knocking doors. Many of them already pay that or more. So I'd be curious to know who would be impacted in the North Shire and how. For every study you see that says that people are going to lay off, fire workers, you will see a study saying that there will be more money into the economy because people will have more disposable income to spend. So it's obviously a complicated issue. One thing that you said that resonated with me, Cynthia, is the thought that we might need some flexibility. I talked to Chris Morrow about this just very briefly. I didn't have a big sit down with him, but one of the things Chris mentioned was that the bill didn't take into account businesses like the North Shire that, for example, offer benefits, to their employees. They're trying to offer a greater package. So,
Okay.
The minimum wage bill is an important piece of legislation. Cynthia and I had a chance to vote on it. As I said before, I was on the study committee appointed by the Speaker. And it tries to achieve something, but I think in a cumbersome and awkward way that is not effective, and it has negative consequences. I think in our first forum, Kathleen, you said that you'd talk to businesses that, as a response, would either reduce hours or lay off workers or go out of business. And I hear the same thing from some businesses, some key businesses. And even one that's phased in at six years, if we get too far out of sync with the rest of the country, and especially with neighboring states, the consequences are even graver. And right now, we have one of the highest minimum wages bills in the country, and it's indexed to inflation. So to jump to 15 would have a lot of negative consequences. And meanwhile, we changed the earned income tax credit to make it better for workers at this level. The earned income tax credit is a refundable tax credit, whether or not you pay taxes. You can pay no taxes and you still get this benefit. We increased the funding for home health care workers, and as a result, some of those lower wage workers, important wage workers, got a raise. Meanwhile, the populations that would be hurt by a minimum wage increase includes seniors who don't work and who would be hit by inflationary impacts, because every study shows there would be inflationary impacts. The child care workers that get hit, child care recipients who get hit by the benefit cliff, that was a huge hit with no accommodation for it, and the businesses. And I've talked to businesses that say, yeah, 6 years, they'll say, this is going to really hit me hard. I might put me out of business. And I say, well, what if it's phased in over 6 years? And this business owner said to me, yeah, I've done the numbers. In 6 years, it's going to put me out of business. So it's not, it's all of that. And as far as solutions, like the benefits, having a company offset their wage with benefits, because frankly, a lot of employees would rather have the benefits than the 50 cents or $1 or $2. We talked about that on the study committee. It got rejected by the majority party, who didn't want any part of that. I think we had a vote on the floor on that, or at least we tried to, and that got voted down. So the people that are supporting the minimum wage are doing it partly, frankly, for political purposes, and partly they're not interested in compromising or trying to find a better way to get there, because there are better ways to get there. We proved it in the last session with things that we did to address the populations that would either benefit or be hurt by this. We tried to address both sides of that equation. It is an incremental thing when you do it more carefully, but to do it precipitously and to get outside of the norm relative to the states around us is just an economic killer. killer in my mind.
I
just
have a,
have
wait,
one thing
wait,
to say.
I have a clarification here because when we talk about the fact that trying to go too far too fast might cause reductions of hours or substitution with technology or even loss of jobs, that's not just some economist study. That is the study by the state of Vermont legislators economist. That's what he said,
Yes.
looking at our specific situation. So it's not just like, well, what can happen theoretically in various places. That's what he said. That's why we need to be. That's why we need to be careful and be cautious. And the other thing to realize is that most studies that say that increasing the minimum wage will not cause job losses are talking about a moderate increase. Remember, we were at 873. If you go to 15, you've 40% increase. Now that's without adjusting for inflation. That is not a moderate increase. That's why I want to hit the pause button, and we can always take this up later. The other problem is, what if we're in this process of raising, there's a recession? There was no exception in that bill for a recession. Raising wages into a recession, you're just going to have more job losses. So this is a complicated area, and it goes to this fact that we need to be sure that what we do will really help the people we want to help, not just have political slogans and gestures as part of some kind of campaign.
Well, the minimum wage now is $10.50 an hour.
$10.50, right?
Yes, but it started at 873 in 2014.
Right.
That's where it was. So if you go from 873 to 15, that is not a moderate increase, even if it's over a number of years.
Kathleen, I know you wanted to say something,
Just,
and then we'll go to
yeah,
closing
just
statements.
quickly. I can't speak to, what folks are saying or doing up in Montpelier, but you did mention compromise, and I think that would be a hallmark of my approach. So I can't take responsibility for what compromise solutions did or didn't get voted on up in Montpelier. I wasn't there, and some sort of compromise would be something I'd be very interested in. And just briefly about the regional competition, I'm pretty sure that New York and Mass are set to go to 15. I think Mass by 2023. New York, I'm not sure the time frame.
They have regional variation in New York, so I don't think New York City is going to have the same minimum wage as
upstate
Adirondacks or
Okay.
something. And see, they refuse to put that in our
Exactly.
bill. And I agree with you. We need to have compromises
So-
that will really work.
So I think something we would all agree that we need to think about is make sure that we don't wind up putting ourselves at a disadvantage, to our neighboring states, because we all want to keep workers here and, not have them go across the border.
But I never got to paid family leave, so let's do that. Paid family leave. You
Real
brought it
quickly.
up. Paid family leave. One of that was supposed to be financed with a small payroll tax. And I'm not sure it would have been sufficient, and many people would have been paying even that small tax and never benefiting from it. I support the concept. I think it should be voluntary, so the state sets up an insurance program and people can participate, employers can participate because they can't offer it by themselves. I also think it's important to note that people who support things like a publicly financed universal primary care insurance program, that would also be financed by a payroll tax. So you really need to go and be careful about all these different programs you propose and how you're going to finance them and the cumulative effect of taxes. It's not that we can't raise taxes or raise fees when there's something we need to do for Vermonters, but we need to be sure that it's sustainable. The worst thing is to promise people something and then fail to follow through because you didn't have the resources, you underestimated what it would cost.
Anyone else want to chime in on paid family leave before we go to the closing statements?
I will just say that I commend the businesses that offer benefit packages that often will include health care, paid family leave, or any other number, flexible time off and things like that. It's not easy to be an employer. The paid family leave bill that came to the House floor was the most aggressive paid family leave board in the country. There was no other state that had proposed something as aggressive. Way too generous, way too taxing everybody, way too a lot of things. And there was no interest in compromising that. That was a bill that they wanted to bring to the floor. And another example, thank goodness I believe that it was stopped, because we have a government that is balanced so that one party cannot put through things that are too extreme, frankly. But it's not easy to be an employer in Vermont, and this would have made it a lot harder.
Okay, can we go to closing statements then? A minute or so tops,
Sure.
just to wrap it all up. And Kathleen, I think since you went last in the opening, you get to go first this time.
All right, closing statements. Well, I didn't prepare a closing statement, but I guess I just wanted to, and I hope that today's conversation demonstrated where I'm coming from, which is that in terms of my approach, I think that more than anything else in political life, I value compromise and I value conversation. I am not a particularly combative person. I like to listen and I like to learn. So I think that my approach would primarily focus on getting out into our district as much as I possibly could. Cynthia mentioned earlier all the work that she does to keep her constituents informed. I'd like to say that I could match that and go even a step farther. I'd like to commit to holding meetings in every town around the district on a regular basis, in addition to all the other things I've talked about, like having an e-newsletter and, of course, keeping my website updated. So getting out there and talking to people and listening would be very important to me. The other thing I believe, and again, I hope our conversation today demonstrated that, is that I am really passionate about public policy that works. I do understand that everything needs to be responsibly paid for and responsibly crafted, and that there can be unintended consequences down the road if you don't think things through. That's why I believe that legislation and policy that's built from the center is the most successful and the most enduring. So while I am a lifelong Democrat and a very proud Democrat, and I think that I'm very deeply rooted in democratic values, I'm always going to be looking to the center for the solutions that work.
Okay, Cynthia.
I guess I would like to remind people in this district that they have 2 votes. So they may or may not have a favorite candidate, but they have 2 votes. And you have 3 people here, so it's like musical chairs. And if you think of the different combinations of 2, those could be very different patterns of representation. So even if you have a favorite candidate, don't throw away your second vote. There are enough people in this district to justify 2 representatives. You want to vote for 2 representatives because the different permutations are very different. I think I'm truly in the center. The center is the best place to be. I have the skills to figure out what will work, whether it's a Democratic proposal or a Republican proposal, based on reality, not politics or wishful thinking. I've been there long enough so that with some of the problems, like the economic finance reform or like the question of how to clean up our environment, I have the ability to analyze things and actually think creatively about the different puzzle pieces. And it's taken me a while to get there, but I really think I have that to offer. It's not that my proposals will always work, but at least I'll have ideas to put out there for other people to work on. And I really think that's a unique contribution. I'm interested in working on the economy, the environment, and social justice, all connected, because I think they're all part of what we care about. And the different policies we've talked about today are part of solving those problems. I don't need training wheels. I'm not at the beginning of my service in Montpelier. I know how things work. I have relationships. I have the expertise. I have the independence. I have the integrity. I ask for one of your 2 votes.
Brian.
Well, Andrew, thanks again to you and to GNAT and to Mark back producing this show for your help in getting these issues out there. I think what we're all saying is we all like the notion of a government that's balanced, and we restored that balance 2 years ago after 6 years of imbalance. And I was part of that restoration of balance, and I hope people have the faith in me to send me back there to represent their interests again. You know, these issues, the votes are out there. You know, I think I cast 177 roll call votes. The fact that I had 3 bills that I introduced and became law demonstrates my ability to work through committees with all interested parties, to present them on the floor, to advocate for them, to present them in the Senate, and have them pass through. You don't do that if you come too hard from one side or the other. And meanwhile, we just touched on a lot of issues where you know, one party does try to, in my opinion, force an issue largely for political reasons, and but some people are true believers in getting to a minimum wage or a livable wage by mandate, and I think there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to do that. But one thing we didn't talk about, and I'll just throw it out there, we didn't talk, and it's going to be an issue. The carbon tax is going to be an issue. There are people who want to raise your taxes on gasoline and fuel oil by anywhere from 35 cents to 75 cents to $1. And they want to make that a cornerstone of the economy, somehow throw it back into the economy and suggest that all this is going to be helpful. It won't be helpful for people in Bennington County. As I said last week, even if you're in favor of a carbon tax nationally, it makes no sense to impose it at a state level, because people will go to Massachusetts or New York and either fill up their cars or hire contractors or do their business over there. But that's going to be a big issue. It's not something that's coming out of the middle. It's not something that people are looking to compromise on. It's a big issue, and so for voters in this area, as you talk to your representatives and candidates, I would encourage them to speak to this issue and ask how it's going to impact their lives. And thank you for hosting this.
Okay, well, thank all of you for being here and for running. And I want to thank you folks too for watching. I hope you found the discussion today interesting and informative. Voting is already underway, I guess, as we speak.
Right.
You can vote now.
You
Yep.
can,
And you can
cast
still
your ballot.
register. You can still register.
Otherwise, you can do it the old-fashioned way and vote on Tuesday, November 6th, and go to the town hall of your town. But again, want to thank Brian Keefe, Cynthia Browning, Kathleen James for being with us today, and hope you found it interesting. And we're going to have a few other candidates before us before the election's over. Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman is going to be coming down. We're also going to be talking to a few other candidates. So stay tuned. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.